Wonderful to see everyone. My name is Eric Alexander. I'm Executive Director of the Brigham Education Institute. And it has been great to be a part of many of our series, but this one I've enjoyed particularly because it's a skill set I wanted to advance in as well, which is the third talk today in our series related to qualitative research in medical education. And a thanks in advance to Amy Sullivan for leading us through this final talk. I'm going to now turn it over to the series lead here and one of my co-faculty within the BEI, Dr. Shubha Ramani, just to give perspective on where we've come from and then formally introduce Amy here ahead. Shubha?
Thank you very much, Eric. It's really been a pleasure to organize these series. Obviously, you can tell that I have no interest in qualitative research whatsoever because I want to organize series like this. No, I love qualitative stuff. And there's something in the power of words. It's difficult, it's challenging, but then you can tell a lovely story. And as I always tell somebody, when I look into the mirror, I see David Attenborough staring back at me. So with that, I would love to introduce Amy Sullivan, who is going to do the part 3 of the 3-part series, You Can Do It. This series has been much more about introducing health professions, educators to the world of qualitative research, people who may not have done much of this form of this methodology and want to get started on it, are curious, or just curious even to learn, is this the methodology that they wish to engage in? So it's really more fundamental, foundational, introductory, if you will. So part 1, we talked about study questions methodology, which is how do you approach qualitative research, the many approaches to study design, and we also touched upon study questions and how the verbs themselves are different, or the construction of the study questions are different. And part 2, our colleague from Maastricht, Janneke Frambach, she presented and she talked about data collection. And to a certain extent, she also talked about trustworthiness of qualitative research. And today, Amy Sullivan is going to present to us, bring this whole series to a close by talking about analysis and reporting. And reporting is not the same as we would do in quantitative research. And it's been a real pleasure. And hopefully, someday you can tell us, we can organize, and I will volunteer people like Amy again to do an advanced qualitative research series, perhaps, when people who are already engaged in the process and they wish to actually discuss a few more advanced questions. But let me introduce Amy Sullivan to you. Dr. Amy Sullivan, and she is a Director for Education Research at the Shapiro Institute at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, although I think it's the names keep changing, so forgive me if I have the name wrong. I think it's B.I. Leahy Health System or something like that these days. Okay. And Associate Director for Research at the Harvard Medical School Academy and Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. Now, she truly is a prolific educational scholar, and leads the fellowship, the Academy Fellowship at Harvard Medical School. And besides, she has mentored people, so many educational scholars in educational research, not just qualitative, but that all I know she's very, very passionate about qualitative research. With that, I'll turn it over to Amy.
Thank you, Shubha. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Eric. I'm delighted to be here and to join you today as part of this wonderful series. I wanted to just start with, let me just share my slides first. Shubha, I do want to say a little shift in emphasis, I hope is okay. When I was working on this, I had so much information. I know Janneke spent some time on analysis. So I'm really going to focus on telling the story because as it turned out, there just was too much to talk about in this. So I'll be happy to give you all references about analysis if you'd like. So I saw this on Twitter. Adam Grant, who's an organizational psychologist, posted this really about how the title was why we should be kind to other people. But I also thought it fit with why we should do qualitative analysis. You know, we really don't know what other people's experience is, what it's like for people in different settings and in groups. And so this really kind of, I think, is emblematic of the way that I think about qualitative research and how it really helps us to kind of be open to and understand at a much deeper level people's thoughts and feelings and experiences about the world. They can help us gain unique insights into our area of interest and help to understand ourselves, and I find, you know, or others and ourselves even better. So as Shubha said, I love qualitative research as well. It's really addictive. You learn so much from it. And I'm so grateful to the people who participate in these studies. We really learn so much from each other. So this also can apply to qualitative research. This is the field of qualitative research, and I have a little bigger bubble there of what I know about it. So I hope to share some of that with you today and find out, you know, what your questions are and hopefully expand all of our understanding and appreciation of it. So I just wanted to show you a few examples of some studies that I've done either in qualitative or mixed methods to give you a sense of kind of some of the range of objectives you can have in qualitative research and how you might apply it. So this was a study that I did with a master's student here, and Leon Liu, he was interested in understanding self-directed learning theory, and he felt that it was primarily applied in the classroom setting, and he wanted to expand the theory to apply to the clerkship setting. So we did an interview study for this. Some of my colleagues at Beth Israel are interested in interprofessional education, and they wanted to know, particularly during rounds in the ICU, what role did nurses play in teaching residents in the ICU? And what was their perspective of it, and how might they develop an intervention to enhance nurses' teaching in that setting? So that was a focus group and a survey study. I'll just show you these other two. We don't have to go through them. Except for we did a 5-year evaluation of the most recent revision of the medical school curriculum, and we used focus groups and interviews and observations, as well as surveys and test scores. So it was really valuable to understand the impact of the curriculum. And this is a study I'm going to use as an example when we talk today. So I just want to introduce it to you. This was a study, a multi-site study we conducted. Grace Wong was the first author. She is now the Dean for Faculty Affairs at Harvard and is a wonderful researcher. She's also the editor-in-chief of MedEd Portal. So we did a multi-site study to look at strategies that faculty use to teach critical thinking. And so that was something that we knew there was a lot of research about what kinds of things work, different interventions, but we really didn't know what people were doing in the classroom setting. So here's our map for today. Shubha already gave us a bit of a recap. I'll just do a kind of touch on some of the same points. I want to talk about some common challenges in writing up research in qualitative methods. Using reporting guidelines. I hope you'll all, if you're not familiar with these, get to know these and use them in your work. And then some breakdown qualitative paper, different parts of it to see how can we think about structuring that? What are some best practices? And then some very specific nuts and bolts about using quotes in your papers, how to present them. My objectives for today are that by the end of the session, you'll be able to list some common challenges to reporting qualitative research. You'll be able to name 2 qualitative reporting guidelines from the Equator Network, which I've shown here on the right. And then you'll be able to describe some approaches to writing and reporting methods, results, and discussion sections. So, what's a talk without having a quote by Albert Einstein? And I really liked this one that it said it would be possible to describe everything scientifically, but it would make no sense. It would be without meaning, as if you described a Beethoven symphony as a variation of wave pressure. So for those of you who were not in the earlier sessions, it really is about a method that explores complex dimensions of human experience. It can generate very rich and detailed data, which is both an advantage but a challenge in analyzing and reporting qualitative data. It allows for really in-depth exploration and understanding contextual understanding. And it's a great complement to quantitative methods. And I see more and more in medical education research and health professions research, mixed methods are becoming more and more popular. Quite often a challenge in what we do with quantitative research is we have small sample sizes. We might have a class that we're working with or a workshop we're developing. And so it's very hard to do often it's very challenging to do a purely quantitative study because you really can't generalize from a small sample. And you might have some more problems with power in your statistical analyses. So it's great to be able to combine the two, and it can give your study a lot more richness. So for just a very brief overview, as Shubha said, we've talked about research questions, and they're exploring context and meaning. It might ask questions about how and why and in what ways people perceive a particular phenomenon. Objectives are multiple. You can use a qualitative to prepare a survey. So you might want to know what domains to study, what language does your target audience use. You might want to complement quantitative methods, as I mentioned. Or you might want to develop theoretical or conceptual models or prepare to develop an intervention. And there are a number of approaches. We won't go into them now, but the part of the point here is to recognize that there's just not one method to use to approach qualitative research. And so these can all take, a lifetime to develop mastery in these. And so just to know the names and start to recognize the language is really helpful. And you can start to learn about each one of these, or just pick one and develop your expertise in that. So as I'm sure you know, the kinds of methods are interviews, focus groups, and observations, and the types of data are usually text and video and images. Shubha, excuse me, I'm just going to stop it. I'm not looking at the chat right now, so would you mind if you wanted to interrupt me if there's a question that I should address right away? So the data analysis techniques, one characteristic of them is that they're iterative. So you might be working with a transcript, you read it, you discuss it with your team, you start to develop some codes, which are ways to think about what you're seeing in the data. And then you go back again and you continue to discuss it. And then you go to the next transcript. So you're kind of always circling back, looking at the code book again, refining it. So that's really very typical of qualitative data analysis. There's different kinds of analysis. There might be content analysis where you're kind of looking at different topics that you see. Thematic analysis is a bit deeper where you're looking at patterns in the data. Discourse analysis, you might be looking at conversations people are having with each other and how you might characterize them. Grounded theory analysis, which is really about building theory. So you're looking at different interviews, collecting more data to try to flesh out a kind of conceptual or theoretical model. And then, as Janneke talked about in session 2, trustworthiness is a big topic in qualitative research. It's kind of the correlate to quantitative validity. And so because so much of qualitative analysis is you as the investigator are the data analysis instrument, you don't have a statistical model where you're reading, you're thinking, you're interpreting it. You're working with your team to develop interpretations and inferences. So we really need to understand how is it that I can convey to my audience that I'm not just telling what I think already and using people's quotes to support it, that you're really doing a rigorous, systematic procedure to analyze your data. So these are things we'll touch on a little bit more later on. So the overarching principle that I see for qualitative, it is rigor, which I just was talking about, and transparency, making your methods known as you're reporting it. And this quote you might have seen before, that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So this kind of captures the idea that we're always filtering what we're seeing and thinking about. So I'd like to ask you some questions. I'll put the chat up now, or if you'd like to just jump in with a question. If you have worked on a qualitative manuscript, what challenges have you encountered? Oops, sorry. I'll give you a moment. And if you haven't worked on qualitative manuscripts, that's fine.
So, Amy, there is one question that asks, can I use thematic and content analysis together in qualitative studies?
Yes. So that's a little bit of a tricky one. I'll do a short answer to it now. There often content and thematic analysis, those terms are used interchangeably, but there's actually a slight difference to it. In the thematic analysis, you're really looking for, you're probably doing some content analysis as you build your thematic analysis, but content analysis is a bit more concrete. You're identifying your themes. You might want to see, like, what are things people talk about the most? What are the least things that they don't talk about? So whereas thematic analysis, you're still doing the same kind of process, but you're looking for conceptual ideas to come up. You might have like 3 different areas of content that will comprise one theme, and then you look at how things relate to each other. There's a wonderful Amy guide. I think it's number 131, but we can find it and send it to you on thematic analysis. So I'm going to scan through. Okay, how much data? I'm just going to make a note of that and come back to it. Reviewers' comments. Yeah, you know, that's a challenge, because then it goes to also the wide range of methods and the kind of flexibility there is in methods. Reviewers can be fairly idiosyncratic. So that is a challenge, because there aren't the kind of standards and sort of a consensus on methods in the same way. So maybe we can discuss that a bit more towards the end. The discussion part is very challenging. Yes. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. There's a paper by Lorelei Lingard that talks about discussion that I think is wonderful. We can give you that. Okay. All right, these are great questions. So I'll touch on some of these. I will try to get back to them later. And if I don't get back to them, maybe I can, Shubha, send you an email with some thoughts on responses to these afterwards.
Sure.
Okay, great.
And, you know, if you can capture the chat, and I can also add to some of this, and perhaps we can post this on the BEI or webpage. Okay.
Sounds good. Great, thank you. All right, so some of the challenges, there are many, of course. Some of the ones that in both my experience and what I see from reviewers, or that as a reviewer, I've noticed are lack of clarity and transparency about the qualitative approach. Often you'll see people will say, we use this method, we use this approach, but they just describe it in a very abstract way. So you really want to be able to break that down and talk about how you apply that in this particular study. And then try to talk about what you did and why throughout. So we'll go through this a bit more in the other slides. Conflating approach with analysis method. This is a bit more subtle, but something to think about when you sit down to write a paper. The approach is a particular set of methodology that you use to collect data, to analyze it, so it's you can sometimes use different kinds of analyses with one approach. So you want to keep them separate so you're not confusing your audience. And I'll show you a few examples of that. Because we get so much rich data from qualitative approaches, it can be overwhelming to us as researchers to how to manage all that data and to kind of reduce it down and pull a story from it. But you also need to do another level of kind of streamlining and simplifying the results so that your reader can understand it, because your reader is not going to be as immersed in the data as you are or know it as well as you do. So you want to be able to be very as concise as you can, but kind of balance that being concise with conveying the story. You want to make sure you have a storyline and you're not just reporting different elements, different themes, for example. And then you want to demonstrate about how you minimized bias, how you address those different areas of trustworthiness. Conclusions can be challenging, as one of the chat questions said. Results in conclusion are less distinct in qualitative than they are in quantitative, because in your results, you do have some interpretation when you're reporting the data. And then in your conclusion, you're kind of tying that together, but there is some overlap. And sometimes conclusions can be superficial. They might just restate that we found these 5 themes, these are what they are, this is what they imply. But you really want to go to kind of the next level of tying together your results, looking at what their implications are. How do they connect to existing theory or evidence? So how do we address some of these? One thing that I don't know if you're familiar with these, if anyone's already seen these, maybe just make a mention in the chat, but if it's new to you, I'd love to know, because I'm always sort of making sure that people know what these guidelines are, where to find them, and how to use them, because they're really invaluable in thinking about how to structure your paper and to keep you kind of making sure you address the key points that you need to. And they're also helpful for reviewers. And more recently, last number of years, I will say in my cover letter or even in the paper that I've used these specific guidelines, because it helps show that you've used a systematic approach. So here's one set of guidelines. This is the standards for reporting qualitative research. And you won't be able to see the details so much, but you'll see for each of the sections of the paper, there's different things to address and then a description of each of those. And my recommendation to you is to not just use these when you're writing up or reporting your study, but to use them when you start to design your study. And that way you can ensure that you are addressing each of the elements that you need to address when you get to the point where you're completed analyzing your data and reporting it. So I'm just going to look in the chat real quick. Oh, thank you, Shubha. Wonderful. So the Equator Network, if this is new to you, please go look at it. This is the web address, Equator Network. This is a consolidation of reporting guidelines for all kinds of studies. It's really invaluable. And it's a searchable website. So if you're doing qualitative study, you can type in qualitative or quality improvement. So these are all compiled here. You can pull up each of these and look at the and get the checklist that I showed you, as well as the explanation around it. It's also a very good website just for hints on writing and reporting. So it's worth spending some time on. So the two qualitative ones I want you to know about is the SRQR, which is Standards for Reporting Qualitative Research. And then the COREC, the Consolidated Criteria for Reporting Qualitative Research, and that's particularly for interview and focus group research. So we'll be working today with the SRQR, and we can't go through all of the items, but I picked out a handful of them that I think might be helpful for you to think about when you're writing up your study. I also wanted to mention the doctrine guidelines. Grace Wong, again, who, as I said, is editor-in-chief for MedEd Portal, which is an online peer-reviewed repository for health professions, curricula, for assessment tools, et cetera. They put together a mixed method study on how to report innovations in education. So this is also really useful if you're working on a qualitative study that involves an innovation or an intervention. So I highly recommend that as well. So for our second learning objective, these are the two reporting guidelines I'd like you to know about, the SRQR and the COREC. So we'll use these guidelines when we think about approaches to writing and reporting on methods, results, and discussions. sections. Now, I spend most of the time here on results. There's always a lot to learn on any of these, and I'll give you some references to read up on some more aspects of this. So this is a great resource. I would encourage you to look at. Lorelei Lingard is an investigator from Canada, and she does this wonderful series called The Writer's Craft. And she covers everything from writing titles, writing abstracts, writing introductions, discussions, etc. And then recently came out with this book with Christopher Watling on story, not study. So she uses this metaphor of a story to think about how we're reporting our qualitative research. So just wanted to spend a moment on one slide on titles, because this actually has a bit of an art to it. And there's always a bit of decision making about what you want to focus on for your title. So in the SRQR, their guidelines are to make a concise description of the nature and topic of the study, and indicating the approach if you can, or you can just say qualitative, and then the data collection methods. Those are recommended. So you want people to read it. You don't want the title to be boring and dull and just say like what you did. So to the extent that you can make it a catchy title or interesting is going to really be a big help to you. You want to be clear, as it says in the guidelines here, and convey specific elements, specifically about the topic and the method, but then still be concise and not have an overly long title. So these were two I picked out that I thought were very good. You'll see that Lorelei Lingard is an author here, Laura Varpio, and others who are also excellent qualitative researchers. So these are two styles that you'll see for qualitative papers. Both of them have the colon kind of title. So they have the main topic, which is critically reflective practice and its sources. So you can see what the topic is and that they're exploring why, what the sources are for this, for reflective practice. And then the method, a qualitative exploration. So this was in academic medicine, and it's fine there to say a qualitative exploration. But if you're publishing in a qualitative journal, like Qualitative Health Research, for example, you don't want to say a qualitative exploration because everything there is going to be a qualitative exploration. So that's where you might want to go a little bit more detail and say a phenomenological study or a grounded theory approach. So that's where you can get more detail. This starting with a quote or a snippet of a quote is very popular. It can be overused, but it's a good thing to think about. If you have a quote like this one, I'm unworthy of being in this space, that's very compelling quote. And so it right away tells you what the topic is. It's a qualitative study because it's starting with a quote, and then more the kind of more concrete version of what the topic is, the origins of shame among medical students. So these are two great titles and ways you can think about. Apologies for the background barking here. One of the things to think about also is to think about your title in combination with your keywords. So if you're familiar with SEOs, that's search engine optimization, that your keywords will help if people are searching for a qualitative study in your topic. You want to put in keywords that will help people find that. So say you have a qualitative exploration here, but you wanted to put some more information about the very specific method. So you can put it in your keywords. So in combination, that's a good way to think about setting up your study to be discoverable. Okay, I'm going to stop and take a quick look at questions. Great, okay. Shubha, thank you for all these great resources. So in the methods part, we'll talk about these five different issues. There are many more, but these are ones that I think people struggle with in particular. And I'll show you some examples from the interview study that we did on teaching critical thinking. So one tip about when you're writing up your study, I find it helpful to write the introduction, or at least draft it, the introduction and the methods first. these are things I know so many people, and I've done this myself, wait till the end of it, you finished your analysis, you finish your study to start writing. It's really inefficient to do it that way. And so if you can start at the very beginning to write your paper, these are two things you can start writing right away. And if you have to put in an IRB application, maybe you'll have something written up about the methods already. So this will really help you when you're ready to work on the paper. So here's the methods about qualitative approach and research paradigm. So these can be confusing for people, but we'll at least get started on looking at what these are and how you might think about writing it. So the qualitative approaches we've mentioned, different kinds, ethnography, grounded theory, etc. And if you have a guided theory, like self-directed learning or some other, theory that you would want to talk about, and then identifying the research paradigm and your rationale. So let me just talk about that in a little bit more detail here. So the approach is, if you might be using a very well-established approach like grounded theory. Sometimes you'll see in the literature that people will say they did grounded theory, but it's kind of like using it as a general term, but they're not really doing grounded theory approach. So be sure if you're using one of these major approaches, phenomenology, grounded theory, et cetera, that you know what's involved in it so that you can present it and describe it accurately. There are other times that you're going to use a more generic approach, and that's been a case for me in many ways. We haven't really done these more formalized approaches, but really wanted to look at a thematic analysis for getting ready for an intervention, for example. And for most journals or reviewers, that's acceptable, but it just might be a little harder to talk about what your approach is. So just as a kind of heads up about that. Paradigm, so we all have our ways of thinking about research and our assumptions about research. This has to do with ideas about philosophical standpoints. And if you really want to dig into it more, it's about epistemology, like how we know what we know, or ontology, what's real or not. And you don't have to worry about those terms right now, but the main idea is, are you someone who thinks that, or in your particular study, do you think you can measure something fairly objectively, even though you know that you've got some filters around, or there's some bias, that there's not a purely objective way of looking at something? Or are you thinking more about things subjectively and knowing that you have a particular standpoint, the people that you're talking to who are participants have a particular perspective, your research team is all going to have, so you want to make that explicit and say, this is how I think about this, this is how I understand it. And so qualitative research tends to be in that camp, in the interpretive or constructivist kind of camp. So if you can, it's fairly, still fairly rare that people will talk about their philosophical standpoint, but more and more I see that reviewers do expect you to talk about that. And I'll show you an example so you can see what that looks like. I'm going to stop for a moment because that might be confusing for people who are very new. So any questions you want to bring up about this so far? We will see more examples soon.
Amy, questions did come up about number and sample size and quantifying qualitative studies. And I answered that question. In fact, a lot of qualitative experts caution us against saying, oh, so many people said this, so many people said this. And in fact, there's, and social scientists who study, say, intimate partner violence, for example, say it doesn't matter if it's not more important if 10 people said something versus one person. If the issue is critical, important, the one person counts just as much as the other 9. So people do caution against counting. So sample size is not, you have the sample you have, and there are other ways to, basically even saturation is a term you may have heard, and people are not using that anymore. They're just saying adequacy. You have adequate information to answer your study question or narrow the gap that you're trying to report. Then another question came up, Amy, and I'll let you, and I'll step back. Another question came up about disagreement with your fellow researchers in terms of, codes and themes. And I said that is actually wonderful, because this is the time to ensure trustworthiness of your data. And it forces you not to look at it from your own little black box of a brain. You would say, why did my colleague find these codes or these themes and I didn't see them? It leads to a great conversation and actually lends trustworthiness or rigor to the data.
Okay, Shubha, let me see. So I'll start with the last thing you talked about. When you are working with a team, you're exactly right. You need to be able to talk about how you're thinking about the data. The way I work with groups, say we have a group of 4, we might meet once a month and say, okay, we're going to start with this one transcript. We'll all read it independently. Then we'll make notes in the margins about what kinds of things we see there, and then come back together and discuss it. And we discuss first the overall, what we saw in the transcript, what ideas we got, what we thought was important. And then we'll go line by line. This person said this. What do we think this means? What would we call, if we had a name, a code for it, what would we call it? So is it like anxiety about, about case-based collaborative learning, or expectations about something? There's any kind of thing that you see in that little excerpt, and you talk about it as a group. And those discussions are really some of what is most fulfilling for me as a researcher, because you develop a kind of relationship with your team where you can say, well, oh, I didn't see that. I thought it was this, or I thought they meant this when I read that. And the reason why is because when I taught critical thinking in this setting, this is how we thought about it. So you're, in an ongoing way, you're bringing in what your filters are, how you're interpreting something and why. And then when somebody else has a very different way of thinking about it, you discuss it. And it's like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. And you may achieve consensus at the end, like, oh, I see, that is what I think they meant. Or you may not. And that's okay too. You could just you keep notes for your meetings of, what you talked about and what you ended up with. So that's all about interpretation and connecting. The idea of reflexivity is where how your own experience, who you are as your gender, your race, your background, your profession, how that informs how you understand a piece of qualitative data. So Shubha, I don't know if I went off on too much of a tangent there, but thank you. You're talking about the answer to positivist tradition. So Shubha, I'll stop with the interpretation and the sample question. Would you mind just telling me that again? The sample size.
Yeah, no, people are always worried about sample size, and there are, in fact, reviewers who are not that experienced with qualitative writing who still ask how many people. However, I think more and more editors and deputy editors are including people with a qualitative background, and they stop asking you about how many, and instead they ask, are your findings, are you reporting the narratives of the participants, or going off on a tangent on your own opinion? Or the other thing is, are you actually reporting data that are aligned with the study questions? Or again, going off all around the countryside, basically. So everything, alignment, you don't have to report everything you ever discovered, but go back to the study questions and what is it that you wish to study.
Yes, that's great. Yes, and when you're talking about your sample and sample size in the paper, I mean, for my rule of thumb for everything, whenever I can, don't just say what I did, but why. So what is your sample? How did you select them? Why did you choose those? Did you pick people so that they represented a range of experiences in a particular area? So maybe I'm looking at students who are in a new curriculum. Do I only get students who didn't like it, or only get students who liked it? Who are they? And any one of those is fine, but you just want to say who's in your sample, who you selected, and why. And then to your point about counting, when you have counting what particular code, for example, you can talk about, people don't use numbers too much anymore, because it's usually, unless it's a survey with an open-ended question where everyone answered that question and it's codable, then you could say 25% of the people said X. But if it's a focus group or interviews, it's very hard to count things and to have it be really representative of the data. So you're more likely to say most people said this, or only one person mentioned this, or a few people said this. And that's a way of showing the relative frequency. So you're not just taking, if one person says something, blowing that up into a big finding, but it may be important. You might want to report it. Okay. Well, I'm looking at the time, and so let me make a decision here. So let me show you, I'll go as far as I can with the first couple of things, and I'll share the slides with you so you can get some more of the detail. But in this study, I'll just show you how we talked about the study. So we said because little is known about health profession faculty members teach critical thinking, we chose qualitative interview methods to elicit rich, detailed, and contextualized descriptions. So what we have here is we talk about the approach. So we say we applied the framework method to analyze these data. And I'll give you a citation for that. It's a particular kind of content or thematic analysis because it offers a systematic, rigorous approach to content analysis that incorporates both inductive and deductive approaches to analysis. And I'll stop there, and I'll tell you what inductive and deductive is in a moment. But as you can see, we didn't talk about the paradigm. So we could have said something about, this is an example from another paper. This work was done from a constructivist orientation. Constructivism maintains that individuals construct knowledge through social practices and interactions. So here they're actually saying what their philosophical approach is, so that it's not positivism, it's more the constructivist side. So that's something we could have improved on this. So research characteristics and reflexivity, we talked about that a little bit. How do we think about our own assumptions and biases? And so we want to be able to talk about reflexivity in the paper and describe who the investigators are, and to the extent that you can, how their different backgrounds might influence how they analyze the data and interpreted the data. So from this paper, I always see when I'm looking over old papers and like, oh, I see all these things I could have done differently. But we simply said that we represented faculty from medicine, nursing, occupational therapy, and educational research. If I were a reviewer, I would ask for more information than that. So that's an area that we could have improved it. I mean, at least we did mention who we were, but we could talk more specifically for this study, how that would impact how we're interpreting these data about teaching critical thinking. So for the data analysis, just look at the description from the SRQR. We want to look at the process that we used, and then, what kind of themes how you identified the themes, and then techniques for trustworthiness. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. Janneke did talk about that in session 2, but we'll just review some of those. So you want to talk about the steps that you used, how you generated codes, if that was the approach you used, how you developed themes, how you refine them, and then steps you took to ensure rigor. As Shubha mentioned, we tend not to use the term saturation anymore. Saturation means that we read this transcript, we identified all the important topics that were related to our study, and so there's nothing new coming up, so we can stop enrolling people in the study, and we don't need to do more interviews or focus groups. For different reasons, that concept has been criticized. And one of the terms they use now is sufficiency. So we don't have the time to go into it now, but I think the important thing is to know that you need to address this idea. I have a reading I can send to Shuba to help you with that. So here's an example of, in our paper, how we reported the analysis methods. So we said that we use this particular framework that has these number of steps. The data analysis involved a blend of inductive and deductive reasoning, and the team held conference calls every 2 to 4 weeks. And we use the strategies. What we did was we put these in the appendices because it was really too much detail to put into the paper. And even though with qualitative papers, a lot of journals will give you an extra word count, like academic medicine will give you 4,000 word limit instead of 3, it's still very hard to get all this information in. So we chose in this case, and I'll just show you before I go back, to show the method, the steps we use. So this was our process. We transcribed it, became familiar with it. We did some coding. So we talked about a general definition of each of these, and then how we applied it in our study. So I'm going to go back for a moment and just show you what a couple of important definitions. So a code, as I mentioned earlier, is what you use to tag segments of text. And it's a way you can start identifying what kinds of ideas are coming up, how they might form a theme, and how themes are related to each other. Deductive analysis is if you go in already knowing what you're looking for. So you know what codes you're going to use, and so you're searching in the data to find evidence of those ideas. Inductive analysis is you go in not thinking ahead what you're going to find, and you're reading and thinking and saying, oh, I see, this means this is a new idea, this is a new concept. A lot of times you'll use both deductive and inductive kinds of analyses, but it's helpful. It can be confusing, these two topics, but it's helpful to know that these are different ways of thinking about approaching your data. So my tip here, as I mentioned before about challenges, you don't just want to have like a boilerplate method. You want to really show what step you did and how you applied it in your study. Now, we also did an appendix for trustworthiness. Then we did the same thing. We talked about, we listed different elements of trustworthiness and then how we addressed it in our study. So these are different elements of trustworthiness that you'll see. Credibility is how believable is it? So you might want to use some techniques like, know that you're really spending a lot of time with the data, you're meeting regularly, you're doing an in-depth analysis. You're checking back with people who are representative of the population, see and run that by them. Does that resonate with their experience? Dependability. Could we, if someone else took this study and replicated it with a similar population in a similar setting, would they get the same kind of results? Confirmability is the closest we have to objectivity. Where we want to find out, we say we did these steps. Well, how did we come to that decision? So you want to be able to do ongoing memos as you meet. So we have an audit trail here is very helpful. A lot documenting the tools and any kind of rubrics you use. And then transferability is the correlate to generalizability in quantitative research. So you want to be able to describe your context enough so that people who want to look at your results will think, does that apply to their particular institution or setting? Okay, so we'll go into results. I think we can get through some of this. And so in the results, you want to think about the main findings. You might be developing a theory or conceptual model. You may not. You might only want to report different themes. And then you have evidence to go along with that. And those are usually quotes or other kinds of qualitative data. So as one of you mentioned in the chat, that this can be really challenging with qualitative because there's a great deal of variation in approaches and ways of presenting it. But one of the underlying things to think about when you're writing your results is that you're telling a story, that you want to make the results both understandable, engaging, and memorable. And so one of the things that's really helpful to do is, if you have a couple of target journals that you're going to think about, is read and get familiar with how they present qualitative data. Often you'll see there's kind of similar expectations. Look at the instructions for authors. It will often tell you what they're looking for and how they want quotes and things presented. So there's two ways of thinking. There's more than two ways, but two major ways of thinking about how to present your results. One is that you list the main themes and you talk about each one in turn, and then you tie it all together. So you're going from these specifics to then the general story. You can do the reverse. You could have an opening summary paragraph for the results, or a diagram or concept map that shows how everything ties together, and then break it down. So those are two ways to think about how you might do that. And it's helpful when you start out your results to say what you did and why. Because there's so much variation, it's helpful for the reader to know why you made that decision. And so I'm going to just go on in the interest of time. This is another one from Lingard, where they talk about writing the results. Talk about in terms of scientific storytelling, and then using quotes and making an argument. So they bring up the idea of a story, thinking about a study or a story. And these areas, methods and results, have a lot about the study, very nuts and bolts of what you did and why, what the results are. The introduction and the discussion can be a lot more about telling a story and creating a narrative. And so this is where you want to think about what elements you have in each of these that are story and study. And they can be in each of these sections, but you want to have, we think about like a plumb line going through. And Shubha, you'd mentioned this before, you've got your research questions. Don't just mention them and don't come back to them. Those are anchoring, what you say and the methods and the results. And so you're going to come back to that again in the discussion. So I'm going to give you an example to make this more concrete. This is a study of focus groups on game-based learning. So the first thing you want to report in the results, as you would with a quantitative study, is who is in it and how you might describe them. And then they move on to the substantive results of the study. So first they give a pre-organizer. We chose to present our findings based on the structure of the focus group discussions. So first they did perceptions of play and leisure time, and then the second question, then the next. Then they even go so far as to say what the formatting means, so that the main themes are in bold and italic, and sub-themes are identified in bold. So you're giving your reader a roadmap of what you did, how you're going to present it, and how they can read read the results. So here they present the first theme, and they say all students like to play, but the amount ranged considerably from once a year to daily. Pleasure seemed to be the common ground as to why students engage in the games. Then they go a little bit deeper, sub-themes and evidence. For instance, fun could come from the joy of winning. Here's a little snippet of a quote. And then they start to look at how what they were highlighting in the discussion was also the sense of anticipation. And then they have a little bit, another quote there. Then they start to tie things together and make some interpretation. So they say the reward uncertainty seemed to modulate the impact of the pleasure experience. And then they give a longer quote to demonstrate what that means. So they're giving the context around the quote. So the reader, leading the reader from one point to the next, they know how to understand it. As you can see there, it's a nice storyline that can convey the results in a very comprehensible way. From the paper that we did, we introduced it a slightly different way. We said to answer the research question, so we went back to the research question from the beginning. We organized the results as follows: what faculty teach, how they teach it, and why. So we presented right away of the conceptual model to guide our readers through our results. And so we started out with this figure, and you can see there's the what is taught, how it's taught, and why. And then we mirrored this in the text. You don't want to, in the text, duplicate what you have, but you can expand on it. So here we said we have 2 guiding principles, relevance to clinical practice and perspective shifting. And then we talk a bit more about it related to the figure here. So that's the scientific storytelling. I'm just aware of the time. Shub, I know we're just getting to a minute away. Let me give you a quick tour so you can see this for later on about how to present quotes. There's an example of quotes from our study, and you want to say who the speaker is, so you're not just using the same person and repeating them over and over. And we talk about making an argument and how you want to think about different ways to present quotes that have frame it, give it more and more interpretation. So apologies for running out of time there, but I'm going to stop if we have, any questions or things to talk more about.
Amy, that was great. In fact, it's almost in need of a part 2 there at the end. That's great.
I know. That's what I felt when I was pulling it together. It's like, this is too much information.
No, I thought it really got into details, and I think it gave us, those of us who are more novice, just an ability to see how you think about it. I was just going to make a comment or a contrast to quantitative publication, was just to pull out a little bit what you said, which is, it appears that you have much more flexibility to not be constrained by just 5 total figures and text. In fact, you even noted how you have appendices and supplemental figures or tables that can very much, I think, put the reviewer at ease as well, that you are being transparent again about what's being said. And I would just, to me, that struck as different. And I'm going to make note of that for my future efforts. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Eric.
I think, Eric, you don't need to be constrained in some ways, but you have to be constrained in others, because people can go off on complete tangents. and I see that as a reviewer. I'm sure, Amy, you do the same. And you really have to bring them back to the story. What is it that you wanted to do in the first place? And where are you at the end? Two different points. You're in Timbuktu already. So come, bring it back, back. But one of the things about the word count, a trick, there are journals which very, very small word count, limited word count. And that's the instance where you put the quotes in a table and then summarize in the results. But others, including academic medicine, they give you 1,000 words extra for qualitative papers. And then it's always much more attractive and the storytelling much more compelling if the quotes and the interpretation are within the text. So it just depends on what journal you are writing for.
Yeah, that's great. And related to the data, I'll just say one real quick thing. We had a team meeting yesterday for a study, and the PI, who's been really delving into the data, has a table with quotes, and we talked about how do we cut these back, because there was so much there. But she said, I'm so emotionally attached to these data, these quotes. It's just like really hard. And Dominique, you're now nodding your head. It really is hard to let things go, but it is something that you need to get other people to help you with, and kind of just keep distilling things down so it's digestible. So thank you again. It's really wonderful to talk with all of you. And
thank you, Amy. Thank you, Shubha, for putting this series together. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It really was one of our more well-attended series, and it's a testament to the content that was so really a great session. And everyone, I hope you have a great evening, good afternoon, wherever you're at, and we'll see you into the future.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much.
thank you.